It was the day that I was ordained. The last words that are spoken in an ordination service are something called the charge. And the charges are words of encouragement that are given to the new person who has been ordained. Words that they can recall during the difficult times in ministry that they may face. And so I was listening to the charge that day. The charge of this service was given to me in a story. The story started with me, actually. The person who was giving the charge described the first time he had seen me, which was the day that I walked into the sanctuary of the chapel in Louisville Seminary. He said, I walked in with a backpack on my back and boots on my feet, and he said to himself, this woman is a sojourner. Then he told the story. It was the story of a family packing up in the parking lot, getting ready to leave the hotel. Their little son was running around the parking lot, and he had a plastic toy sword. And he was waving the sword all over the place while he was running around the parking lot, slaying all the villains that were in the parking lot, until the father scooped him up and put him on his shoulders to take him to the car, and the little boy was still waving the sword, trying to kill all the villains in the parking lot, not even knowing that he had been lifted up onto the shoulders of his father. Remember, I was told, you always stand, you always sit on the shoulders of people of faith, going back centuries, or people who are alive today. Without them, you will not be able to do ministry. Well, the people who are being addressed by our scripture today in Hebrews were in a really tough spot. These words that were given to them were words of encouragement just to help them get through the next day. They were in a place where the Roman government was persecuting them and killing them, and they were also at the very same time being thrown out of the synagogues where they worshiped. How would they ever have enough courage to go on to the next day? Our writer of Hebrews speaks to them with these words in Hebrews 11 and 12. Starting with the first verse of Hebrews 11. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And skipping ahead to verse 32. What more should I say? For time will fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. The first sermon I ever preached was on this text. I was still in Skokie, Illinois. I hadn't left for seminary. And my pastor of my home church, Colette, told me that I could preach a sermon. Well, I already knew what I wanted to preach on because these words were in my heart and had been in my heart for many months before I left for seminary. So I preached on, therefore, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. I did the best I could for a person who had never preached a sermon in her life. I was very anxious to do this thing called preaching because I was an untested middle-aged woman who was leaving for seminary, and so I was very, very excited about what I was going to say. And so after I'd finished preaching, my home church pastor came up to me and she said, "That was good, Karen. Over the years, you'll probably remember not to try to put all the knowledge that you have into a single sermon." When I showed the sermon to my boss, who was a faithful Lutheran woman, she looked at me and she said, "You took a verse-by-verse approach. Do they still do that?" So there you are. It was a little bit not as wonderful as I wanted it to be. But I will tell you this. These words that I just read to you, they're one of the greatest sermons ever written. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, the people that were hearing these words were starving for a word of encouragement. They were longing for someone to take them up onto their shoulders, and they could not feel that they were going to be carried through this very difficult time. And that's why the book of Hebrews was written. But it's also written for us because we too face challenges just like these people faced. You notice in that sermon that the author describes Jesus when he's facing his crucifixion as for the sake of the joy placed before him endured the cross. When I first read those verses, I asked myself, what kind of joy could Jesus possibly see when he chose to endure the cross, forsaking its shame? He must have seen something out there on the horizon, something that brought more joy than the suffering he was experiencing. Perhaps it was the joy of obeying God completely, or the joy of fully releasing his life into the arms of God. Perhaps it was the joy of finishing his work finally. Or maybe it was the joy of redeeming this whole world that God so loved. Faith does not seek a return on investment. We cannot look at a person's lot in life and discern their faith from that. Because faith is often hidden. And we are all given different journeys to walk. We do not understand why some of us walk such different journeys than others, and why some journeys contain so much suffering and others not as much. We do not get that because the reason for that is hid in the purposes of God beyond our vision. But we are taught in this passage that our life of faith is like a long-distance race. But it's not like most of the races that we train for that I'm familiar with. If I wanted to run a marathon, for example, I would know how long it was. I would probably also study the course. I might even drive it to see where were the hills and where were the flat places and such. And I also would know something about what this race was going to demand of me, physically, emotionally, mentally. But what about this race we're running, our lives, and the faith that we need to run this race? Well, we don't know the distance. We have no clue of that. We don't know the obstacles that could come before us, the things that will block our way, the things that will break our hearts, the things that will drive us to despair and threaten to undo us. We do not know any of these things, even as we're running the race. So what words of encouragement do we need to continue on in this race, this life of faith? Two things are mentioned in this passage. The first is that we must fix our eyes on Christ. That can be hard sometimes because all sorts of things cling to us and tear at our clothes as we're running along through the thistles of life. There are many things that distract us. In those moments, when we are feeling distracted, overwhelmed by circumstances that stand in our way in our lives, we are told to fix our eyes on Christ. On Christ. Why? Not just because He has saved us and He has given us eternal life. We fix our eyes on Christ because we need to do this each and every day, because Christ is going ahead of us. He's always going ahead of us. Just like when He was resurrected from the dead and the angel said to the women at the tomb, He has gone on ahead of you. He's gone ahead of you to Galilee. Well, He's gone ahead of us in whatever journey that we are traveling. And we are to watch Him and fix our eyes on Him because He is showing us the way by going on ahead of us. The second thing we need to remember in the journey of faith is to lean on the shoulders of others. The little boy who was waving his toy sword didn't even know he was on top of the world because he was on his father's shoulders. We all have shoulders to share. And when we have difficult times, we need to use those shoulders and provide them for each other. We were made for each other. We need to receive the help that is presented to us each day. That is something you all have taught me here in my ministry. That I lean on your shoulders too. I do not just lead you, I rest on your shoulders, and you raise me up too. You have put me on your shoulders in difficult times. And you can do that for each other, for that is what we are here to do in this world, to provide love, and help in difficult times. My aunt, she's probably about 80 now. She has cared for her handicapped son for all the decades of her adult life. And a couple of weeks ago, the week that I went to Louisville for the inauguration, I got an email from her. And she said she sent it to all the cousins, so this was some 20 or 30 people. Matt is afraid nobody will remember his birthday, she said. She said, so please, send out something encouraging, a happy birthday card or a note. And so we all did. We all sent Matt a note on the same day. It was his birthday, and he did not have to worry that nobody remembered his birthday. Well, Dot also had to care for her husband for many years because he faced many, many illnesses. And I remember the times years ago when she would send out not only an email, but perhaps a phone call or a card, and she would say, Don is in really a difficult place. He's having a really hard time. Please send your help. Please send your words of encouragement. And we all did. And it did help. This is what we're here to do. We are not alone. We need each other. And you, all of you, have been part of my great cloud of witnesses all these years. And you will always be in my heart.